really feeling very Lumen-esque in here. We are being recorded.
They record you without you knowing it, though. That's how Lumen does it.
Welcome to Real Over Ideal, the podcast where we love a deep dive into themes of work-life balance, managing grief, and family systems as they show up in pop culture. I'm excited to introduce you to our extremely special guest, Alan Stair, the creator of Severed, the ultimate Severance podcast. If you've been immersed in the Severance universe, as I've been, you already know Alan, a retired advertising executive with over 40 years of audio production experience, whose entertaining and meticulous analysis of Apple TV's Severance has made him a respected voice among fans, show contributors, and creators. In fact, Ben Stiller and Adam Scott invited Alan onto their Severance Companion podcast, which is a behind-the-scenes breakdown of each episode of Severance. Alan's appearance with Ben and Adam speaking about Apple TV's Severance cemented his role as a true authority in the world of Severance. Alan's blend of deep research, production insight, and intense curiosity has turned his podcast into the go-to resource for anyone who wants to understand the show on a richer, more nuanced level, complete with those behind-the-scenes nuggets fans love. But never fear, you don't need to be a Severance fan to appreciate today's episode. A discussion of Severance with our guest, also known as Alan S., will be a jumping off point to explore the ideas you come here for. The imperfect but epic reality of being human. And one more thing, spoiler alert for both seasons of Severance and Pluribus, because Alan has a new podcast called Hello Carol, which is also terrific. So if you are enjoying Pluribus or want to learn about it, please check out Hello Carol. Welcome, Alan, to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Now, you didn't get the second part of the Hello Carol title in there. It's Hello Carol, colon, the ultimate Pluribus podcast. I'm making this ultimate thing kind of my brand now. It's that insane deep dive, going way too deep into the show, finding too many things. For some people, they love it. Other people are like, you're nuts, dude. I'm not listening to this. So, and that's fine. I mean, it's not for everybody, but boy, the people that love it. And I'm so glad to have that audience.
Well, I am a member of that audience. I absolutely love your podcast. I have listened to it on walks, in the shower. You've been everywhere with me, Alan. As someone who likes to really dive deep myself into things, I'm sure that Hello Carol, the ultimate Pluribus podcast, is going to be a huge hit. And I'll say something else, and that is this whole podcast for you and me is a very deep dive because we recorded a whole podcast yesterday, folks. I unfortunately referred to it as a dress rehearsal, and that's exactly what the universe gave me. So now you are getting a fresh version of us, but it's that much better because I get a little bit more of Alan's time, and he really is a pleasure. And I am so appreciative you're spending this extra time with me recording this again.
I don't know. Glad to do it. And actually, this kind of, yesterday after we were done, there were things where, I forgot to say this or I forgot to mention that. So now we got a chance to go back and fix that. So, that's a good thing.
That's right. And we were also talking before we hit record about how this podcast is kind of severed. We had one recording and now this is our severed recording. I'm not sure which one is the innie and which one is the outie, but so be it. And before we get into the more deep themes of work and life balance, I did think it would be fun to kick things off with a little game that you've heard. So now we'll actually have some other things to talk about within this game. And it is called Is it severance or word salad? And for the listeners, here's how it works. I'm going to read a very short blurb, and I'd like Alan to talk with us about whether it's from the world of severance or if it's Lumen jargon or just corporate doublespeak. Okay, so Alan, are you ready for this mysterious game you didn't play yesterday? So the first one is the work is mysterious and important.
Yes. And Mark S. says this for the first time with such intensity. I can hear it in my head right now.
Me too.
He was insulted to have anyone question the value of the work. And that is a great statement about Lumen's ability to instill that sense of pride in your work, even though you have no idea what you're doing, to still feel like what you're doing is important, that having that sense is what gives him purpose.
I think in work and life too, in a lot of senses, having the feeling that your work is important, even if it's not terribly important, even if it is part of just a very, very large picture, is a really good way to get workers engaged. So even though we all know, again, spoiler alert, turn this off if you haven't seen Severance. But even though we know that Lumen is very evil, that is a good way to get your workers involved. It's to have them think that what they're doing is important or to feel that their work is important. What do you think?
You're calling Lumen evil, and until we find out they're planning to kill someone or that they're holding someone against their will and have been for 2 years, until we find all that out, they're really just being corporate. They're not being evil. They're just being your boss and controlling what you do, which was what bosses do. They're dictating the work you do, the time that you do it in. All of those things are just corporate endeavors. They're not evil, but Lumen does it in such a way that it just feels icky. There's a weird feeling to the way Lumen handles things.
The way that Mark talks about you leave your job at Lumen, you're essentially giving up that part of you that exists. I think that is true when you leave a job, although is not quite as serious. If you think about it, that is what can make corporate life kind of evil. One day you can be at work and the next day you can be being escorted out by security. So I feel like it really does touch that nerve of corporations being evil places at times, even if they're not literally murdering people and sacrificing goats as well.
Well, and I kind of think it lends itself also to the employee and how much they identify with their job as a marker of their personality or as an identifier of who they are. If you're a CPA and that is just all you think about, all you do, you work for a company as an accountant and you bring your work home with you, you work over the weekends, you're very tied to that identity as a CPA. If you suddenly lose that identity, you feel adrift, out on the ocean. But if you can keep a distance to that and keep a personal life and keep an existence that's outside of that corporate identity, then if you get cut off from that corporate identity, you've still got you. You is still, a valuable person that can go out and look for another job. But if you tie yourself to that job, and I know, people that are long-term career, 40 and 50 years with the same company, I know a lot of auto workers, fell into this. They were so tied to that plant or that, that place that they have gone to every day for the last 35 years to suddenly have that closed down. There were a lot of guys in situations where they just felt so displaced and so lost, not having that company tie or that identity as my job. And I think that's where, with Lumen, you don't even know what your identity is as your worker, as your job. And I think that creates another kind of unhealthy disconnect. There has to be some communication between the business you and the personal you, and you got to work that out so that one is not dominant and taking over the other one. In the case of Lumen and Severance, you don't have a chance to marry those two together. You exist as one and you exist as the other, and there is no crossover between them.
That makes a lot of sense. And it actually brings me to our second game question. I'm wondering if you recognize this quote, and that is, your job needs you, not the other way around. Where'd we get that expression from?
That is the incredible Rickon Laszlo Hale. And I believe it's PhD. I think he's got PhD on there somewhere. I don't know who gave Rickon a doctorate, but Rickon wrote that in the You Are. You are not defined by your job.
I think PhD stands for per his desire. because I can't imagine anybody gave him like a doctorate of letters. And, you never know.
As my father used to say, what PhD stands for is it's piled high and deep.
Yes. And I think actually, as we talked about yesterday, if you're really into the whole Severance universe and you're interested in reading some really intensely ridiculous self-help that turned on the innies, you can see Ricken's the you are, which is where that line is from. Your job needs you, not the other way around. You can read that for yourself. I think it's on Apple Books. Is that right, Alan?
Dan Erickson, the creator of the show, the writer and creator, the guy that came up with the whole Severance idea, loved Ricken as a character, and he loved writing things for Ricken. Well, there's a scene where Mark finds this book. Mark S., the innie component of Mark, finds this book that has inadvertently been left down on the severed floor in his work area. And it is this written by Ricken. Well, at certain points, there's some scenes where he has to pick that up and flip through a few pages of it, and he's reading different things out of it. And Dan was very concerned. He wanted to make sure that those pages he flipped through had real content on them. We don't want to flip through, a lot of times what happens in production like this is they take just a book, just any published printed book, and put a customized dust cover on it to make it the one that's in the show. And then when you're flipping through the interior pages, they are the interior pages of this other book. Well, Dan didn't want that. He knew we were going to see those pages up close. People are going to freeze for a minute like me. They're going to be looking, to see what's really said on those pages. So he started writing as Ricken and said he was just having so much fun writing as Ricken. He just kept writing, and he generated about 40 or 50 pages, he said in one interview. Ben Stiller said he has read those pages and thinks they should be published. So they took a chunk of it. It's like 3 chapters of the book. And the claim is, due to some, legal issues, the other chapters have been suppressed and we can't release them just yet. And there's some, something keeping them from getting out there. But these pages that Dan wrote are now available on Apple Books if you go look for the UUR. And it tells you it's just there as a placeholder that the full book is going to come eventually. Well, I don't think we're ever going to see a full book. But Ben Stiller did say he's strongly encouraged Dan to go finish the UUR and write it as Ricken because it is so much fun. But it's hilarious. I mean, it's really, there are a few things in it that, probably are legitimately nuggets of wisdom. But for the most part, it's just a hoot.
Yeah. Well, actually, I do think it's kind of wise to say your job needs you, not the other way around. I think that that's very true. Myself being like a real dedicated Generation X girly, I have, whenever I could, I would really try to make sure that there was a big separation between my work and my life. I wanted to say, and I don't know if you heard this on Ben and Adam's podcast. I think it was in the first episode. This will show how deep into this Severance universe I have gone. Dan Erickson told a story that Ben didn't know, which is that he took his own blood and used his blood to make a handprint on all of the original scripts that he gave to Red Hour. Do you know this? Red Hour Productions. And he said, he was telling this story on the podcast, and I think it pretty much tells us all how dedicated to this story and to the writing and everything Dan Erickson really was, and how good it was he kept that story from them, because I think they may have really thought twice about working with someone who might do something like that, although the story was amazing and so creative and original. So anyway, I love that story, though. That was, I believe, their first episode of their podcast.
Have you ever read the original, and I'm getting way Severance deep here, but the original script that he submitted?
No, but I heard him talking about it with the Rat and Ms. Cobell, and that's crazy.
The rat is severed. The rat is severed, and when the rat is its outie, it's fine. But when she converts it to its innie, it becomes very frightened because it only gets shocked when it's an innie. It's a much darker script, and they even reverse the roles in it. Helly's the one that's already down there, and she's the one that knows the severed floor, and Mark is the newbie, and he becomes the one that's, we're kind of experiencing it through his eyes. But it's a much darker script and a much different kind of attitude than what ultimately became the pilot. And I find that so interesting. I mean, it's the same idea, the same basic idea, but the way it's presented and the way it's structured is so different. And the fact that they were able to take this initial germ of an idea and sit down with it and go, okay, this is a little much. I think we're going to scare viewers if we bring them into this world that you've got here on the script. But what if we soften it a little bit, make it a little less imposing and scary and dark? And what ultimately then came out of it is the series, which still has some of those dark, scary elements, but they're so covered up by the bright white happiness of Lumen and the severed floor.
Yeah, I think we're also getting the comic stylings, at least of Ben Stiller, perhaps, and others on his team, because I do think that Ben Stiller is extremely funny. He's a serious guy, as I understand it, and he really takes his work very seriously. But I think he is the son of incredibly famous, amazing comics, Jerry Stiller and Ann Mira, if you are aware of who they are. And actually, I also can go deep. There is a documentary, and I think it's on Apple TV right now, where
yeah. His mom and dad.
Yeah, and you can kind of see how he grew up in this real comic atmosphere. And I know the whole nepo baby thing is out there, but I mean, he's like the best nepo baby I could imagine. Like, I remember MTV and seeing Ben Stiller come up on MTV and Reality Bites. He's got a long history. And my husband and I were just watching Night at the Museum with Ben Stiller as the star. And he is really a funny physical comic as well. So I think a lot of that comedy, maybe that brand kind of comes through. With Ben Stiller kind of influencing the direction, especially having directed, 6 episodes of that first season and sort of driving it as an executive producer as well. So it's nice that we have some of that comedy, because it is a dark, Lumen has some very dark corners, right?
Well, as heavy as it is, that's something that I said several times in the podcast. You got to remember, this is the same guy that brought us Dodgeball and Zoolander. He's a goofball. He's got a lot of comic sensibility to him, and he's a funny guy doing these serious kinds of shows. I mean, if you look at Escape from Dannemora, which I watched early on, I didn't know Bennett had anything to do with it. And when I heard about it, I'm like, oh, I got to check this out. It is the retelling of the true story of a prison break, and just very well done. It also features Patricia Arquette, which is, another pairing of those two working together is just fantastic. So, you see Ben, this comic goofball, the guy that gave us Zoolander. I just think about some of those looks that he does in Zoolander, telling these serious stories in such a great way. But every now and then there's a little pop of comedy in there. We get a little something funny. And I think the Laurel and Hardy aspect of Irv and Dylan, they're the comic relief. They're the Statler and Waldorf sitting over there, firing at each other and making comments about everything around them. And I think that really they're probably a lot of Ben seeping into the scripts, I think, is what we're seeing there, is the goofiness from those guys, the muscle shows and all the laughs that they interject into this very dark situation.
One of my favorite Ben Stiller, like, it's not just a Ben Stiller movie, but a movie that he was in, Something About Mary. I mean, there's some really hilarious moments with Ben Stiller in that movie too. Anyway, obviously big fan of Ben Stiller's work. And I think that he obviously brought some of that comic styling as we're talking about. Let's go back to our game. The last one is, am I livestock? Who said that?
That would be a Helly quote from like the cold open almost. I think that's in the cold open. Yeah, she asked, am I livestock, thinking she's being grown for food. And Mark's response is, do you think we'd have done your nails if we were growing?
Yes, I love that too.
A nice dress and do your hair if we're going to eat you. It's not going to happen.
Yes. And in all seriousness, I do love in that, I guess we're still in the cold open of the show, the real commitment that Helly has to, I'm getting out of here kind of thing, where she throws the speaker box at Mark's head. And it's actually a comic moment, but it also, underneath it, you can see how terrified she is for her life. She's fighting for her life. She doesn't know what's going on, but she's like, get me out of here. Stop talking. She's a really interesting character in that moment, just like kind of with her only history being, I woke up in this room and I'm terrified and I don't know what's going on.
She's a spark plug. She's a firebrand. I mean, they've never seen anything like that. Marcus, the innie, is just such a nice guy, such a quiet, milquetoast kind of guy. And I think he's shocked in that moment. It's like, how could you be so resistant to this and so mad when you don't even really know what this is yet? But Helly was fighting from the moment she woke up. She was ready. She didn't like where she was. She wanted out of there. And that really was kind of her overarching attitude throughout the entire first season is let me out of here.
Yes.
And slowly warming up to the idea, which Mark told her in the first episode, there's a life to be had here. It's not a full life, but there is a life here. And I think she was kind of slowly warming to that. And we see that more in the second season after we get past the fake Helly, which again, huge spoilers for Severance, people, season 1 and 2. When we get past the fake Helly and Helly returns, now she's more rah, let's keep this life going down here that we have instead of, and I think kind of it's because she saw who she was on the outside and she'd rather not go back to being that person. She wants to be Helly R down on the severed floor and seems to embrace that more in the second season. In the first season, all she wanted was out until she found out who she was.
The question I have is, what are those themes that you think all the fans and yourself, myself, but let's talk about the themes that people really connect with in Severance, because see like how Helly develops as a person and where she heads in her character arc. I think we also see a lot about how people are when they're not at work versus how people are when they are in work and how deeply people can go into work. So there's the corporate satire business. There's also the whole part about Mark grieving and, as I was saying, work-life balance. What do you think people are resonating with most with Severance?
Based on what I get in as emails from listeners, and also I'm constantly trolling and patrolling the Reddit threads, and I'm on Facebook, and I'm always just looking for people's comments and what they're talking about and what they're posting and what Severance is kind of bringing out of people creatively. And it really seems to be far and away the send up of the corporate life of cubicle land. And you get so many people that in their work, they'll take a snap of like I'm going into a room to have a review, and there'll be something on the wall that is Severance, a reference, some kind of a reference, and they'll post a picture of that on Reddit. So I think really it's that idea of my work isn't as bad as working on the severed floor, but I've had little wisps now and then that remind me of that. I feel that sometimes at work. And I think the fact that there's this shared idea of we're all kind of going through this if we're working, in Amazon or Apple or, whatever huge corporate structure it is, we all kind of have this sense. And the fact that I'm not facing this alone, I'm not the only one looking at this going, this is a little crazy. I think that gives people some strength and some sense of kind of fighting the man as a group instead of, being that lone soldier that has to go in and put up with this corporate absurdity every day, wherever it is you work. So a lot of people, it's more like kind of the hand holding and backslapping. It's like, I've been there too. I understand what you're going through. And that's a lot of that shared experience that shows up on social media in regards to Severance. I think that's the thing that most touches people. You get some of the side things of it, the dealing with grief and the cult aspect of it are interesting. But ideally, it's that send up of corporate culture and taking it to that nth degree. You only exist at your job. The only part of you that we're interested in is the part that works for us. We don't care about what's going on in your other life. This is the you that we want. And I think that is what a lot of people identify with.
I mean, certainly for me, I could say that that's like the gateway for interest. And then, of course, myself as a therapist, it's interesting to me to think of all the other themes. But I think that because we get that connection with corporate satire, and if you think about it even further, it's just satire of being under the thumb of an authority figure that people connect with as well, and feeling resentful about that and feeling like they can't be themselves. The running joke is, well, yeah, like in Severance, you're really your two selves, your innie and your outie. So it really plays off of that crazy, almost science fiction-y notion. My husband and I were having this conversation about the worst part of the OTC being they could wake you up. But guess what? You're now
Reach
at
out
work
and
for the rest of your life. Even if you quit, they could still just wake you up. You're now
reach
at
out
work.
and yeah, just reach out and convert you just wherever you are. Well, that's why I was thinking about Mark as his innie becomes fairly well traveled. I mean, he goes to Rickon's place, then he goes to the birthing cabin. He's really getting out there where the other innies know nothing but the white hallways. He's getting out and kind of seeing the world. So he's becoming a very well traveled innie.
Then I ask you my next question, which is some people say do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life, as we're talking about corporate satire. But some people say that's very unrealistic. So when we talk about you doing your podcast, and it's sort of a labor of love, what are your thoughts about being immersed in work? And maybe tell us a little bit about Hello Carol, the Ultimate Pluribus podcast while you're at it, because I know that's a very exciting new project of yours.
Well, there's something that I thought of in regards to this, you'll never work a day in your life if you do something you love. Did in the open time, we had quite a bit of time between season 1 and season 2. And I didn't want to completely leave the Severance population entirely. I wanted to keep a hand in and stay in touch with people. So I created something I called the Origins series. And the Origins episodes were looking at those properties in pop culture that Dan Erickson has cited as being his inspiration for Severance. So I went back and started breaking down those movies. I looked at Matrix was one of them that I'm a huge fan of and I loved, and I did like 3 hours on The Matrix. But one of them was Office Space, which is a Mike Judge movie going back to 1999. And in it, one of the characters talks about having a high school guidance counselor who said, if you had $1 million, if you had $1 million, what would you do? With your life.
Nothing.
Well, the guy said, if you say, well, I'd work on old cars because I just want the time to work on old cars. Well, then what you ought to choose as a career is be a mechanic, because that's the thing you love to do. It's the thing you would do if you didn't have to work for money. One of the other characters says, well, he uses some rather colorful language, but he says that's a fallacy. We'd never get any janitors or fry cooks, because nobody's ever going to say, if I had $1 million, I'd love to go clean toilets. It's not going to happen. But we have to have somebody out there that's cleaning toilets. That's a job that needs to be done. So it is possible that you're going to have a job that you don't love, and you will be working those days that you were going to that job. But those that have the luxury of finding a job that is that thing that if you had $1 million in your bank account, you would go do anyway, those are the people that never work a day in their life. I feel like in my life, I got into radio when I was 15 years old. All I've ever done is something associated with radio, television, or advertising. I love that. I love doing that. I love coming up with ad campaigns. I love writing spots, all of it. And I got paid for it. So, I was able to do that. Not everybody is able to do that. I mean, you drive by a road crew and guys are shoveling hot asphalt into potholes, probably not as excited about their job as I am. But I mean, both very, very necessary jobs, and probably the pothole filler way more necessary than the guy writing TV commercials, so it is a great thing to aspire to, but I don't know that it is always possible. And that little vignette in Office Space really kind of illustrates that. If you had $1 million, you're not going to choose the crummy jobs.
I suppose so. And I loved your Office Space exploration because I am also an enormous fan of Office Space. I could probably say it line by line, which is why I had like the outburst of nothing, I do nothing. And it's the inimitable Dave Herman, I believe, who says people wouldn't, clean up, will beep nobody off the floor. Right. So, but when you bring that up, and this is something we didn't touch on yesterday about Office Space, and Office Space is such a huge cult hit. Lawrence, the character who's the next door neighbor who can hear everything through the wall. Right. Yeah. He's a construction worker, and he seems pretty dang happy with his life, because actually Lawrence is not asking much more from his job other than, let me go do my construction work, put up the drywall at the new McDonald's or whatever. And then I'm going to come home and, dream about, winning $1 million and getting 2 women at the same time, because that's what he talks about what he would do. So, and then
I love how Lawrence has evaluated himself very effectively, because Peter asked him, he said, is that really something you need $1 million to do? He said, hey, for a guy like me, yeah.
Yes. And he's so funny, that actor. I don't know the actor's name, but he's hilarious.
Oh,
you know that actor's name?
Yeah, and I can't pull it up, but he was on the Drew Carey show. He was the second on Drew Carey. He was Drew's best buddy. He's the only other guy that was in every single episode of Drew Carey, and I can't come up with his name. I think it's kind of a German name, but I apologize to him. But he was so fantastic as the next door neighbor, and kind of being that dose of reality. Where all the guys that worked at Inatrode were, and then they had the chance to go work for Initech. That's right. But
yes.
All the guys that work for Initech are kind of in this weird. It's almost like a hamster cage, that they're in. That's driven by the weird bosses that they have and the strange corporate culture that they have. And then Lawrence, who's a construction worker, it's just fresh air. And I got to move this pile of stuff over to there, and I have accomplished something today. And I go home feeling like, hey,
yes,
I accomplished something. I did a good job. And once at the end of the show, and spoiler alert for Office Space, at the end of it, Peter joins him out on and Peter is just so fulfilled by this job, and they're basically cleaning up a disaster space after a fire. But for Peter, after living the corporate life in cubicle land, suddenly now this is the thing he's wanted. It's hard labor, it's physical labor, it's getting him outside, but this is his dream job. And he has that sense of, I'm doing what I love and getting paid for it. So it's whatever fulfills you, I guess, is the thing that is going to reach that, attain that goal of, if you do what you love, you never work a day in your life. If, maybe it is working on a construction crew, that might be the thing you want to do.
Yes. And I think going back to Severance also, you'll have to help me out here, because I'm remembering the scene where, and it's definitely one of the 4 characters, it's not Helly, who says, everything was fine before Helly got here and messed everything up. Like, we were all happy. Just who says that? I'm trying to.
Irv
it was Irv.
Irv said it, because
right.
Irv said it was so much easier back when it was just refining. Now, now that these emotions are in there, and the real world things are in there. And I think that kind of goes to the idea that Lumen, it was working. Lumen's idea to separate you and sever you from your outside existence is going to make you more focused and make you more adherent to the job. You're not going to be wandering off to the water cooler and talking about what you did last night with your coworkers. You're going to keep working, and it's going to be much easier to keep you working, keep you focused. And I think it kind of proved, when some of these outside things started infecting or interacting with the severed workers, how it messed up that biosystem down there on the severed floor. If you keep them only focused on the work and only focused on the company and furthering the company, and they're fine. When you bring in these other things, you start having real human emotions popping up and real connections happening between these people. Suddenly now that upsets the apple cart down there on the severed floor. And I think it kind of points to the fact that Lumen was right. They had the right attitude. If we can completely remove you from your outside life, we're going to have a better worker.
Yeah. And of course, that's completely unrealistic, because we can't forget about our personal lives entirely, or hopefully we can't when we're at our jobs. But that does bring me to the part of the podcast that we never reached yesterday that was completely severed. And that is, if you try this, you won't die, which is the part of the podcast where we talk about some practical solutions to real life problems. And we're going to base ours today on severance. So I guess maybe I'll jump off to that first, which is, how can people keep their wits about them, do you think, Alan? Like, what advice would you give as a person who had a lengthy career and is now retired and actually jumped into another project? How do you keep a balance, or even if you're dedicated to your work as you are, even if it's a hobby that became another job, how do you keep that balance in your life or seek it when you are getting out of balance? What advice do you have for the listeners, if any?
I'm not the guy to be giving you that advice because I tend to work all the time and I balance effectively, and I probably should spend more time trying to do that. Instead, I just like to work. I like to work. And now that I'm retired, it used to be when I had 22 years, I had my own advertising shop, which I was my own boss, and then everybody thought, wow, that's cool, and I worked from home. When the pandemic hit, everybody had to suddenly start working from home. I was kind of like, hey, welcome to my world. I've been doing this for 20 years now. So having the office in your house, you never really leave the office. It's always there. I tried some little tricks, just mental games of when I go downstairs from the attic where my office was, I'm now home and don't go back up there. But I would find myself going back up and doing things. And, so it is hard to completely divorce yourself from that connection and that relationship because it is such a big part of your life. But I think it's being able to put that away and say, okay, I'm not at work anymore. I'm at home. I need to now concentrate on connection with family, concentrate on doing things that relax me, doing things that I enjoy that are other than work. And that's kind of probably my downfall is the things I enjoy in my personal life are also things that relate to my work. So there was a lot of crossover there. And I started really towards the end before I retired, I was starting to look at trying to get into things that are very different than what my work is. One of the things I started riding a bike. Bicycling is you cannot edit a spot on a bike. It doesn't happen. So, that was a whole different thing for me to be involved in. And it was fun. It was, a exercise and it was fresh air and, all those kinds of things. So trying to find things that interest you, that you like doing, but are not an offshoot of your job is probably at one point. Okay. So in my job, a lot of still photography and videography. I was always pointing the camera at things and I was always shooting commercials and I directed commercials. And so in my personal life, I was thinking, ooh, I ought to take up photography as a hobby because I got this really nice camera equipment. Well, that's not a good idea because it's the same thing. I'm working with the same equipment and doing similar things that I do when I'm at work. Now, making this a hobby doesn't seem right in my head. It's kind of like a photographer that would, on the weekends just loves to go out and just shoot things, and for themselves. You're not getting away from your job. You may love that. And, and I love like talking about Pluribus and talking about the different podcasts that I've done since I've been quote unquote retired. Those for me are hobbies, and they are. And my wife, when she retired, she's a retired teacher, got into painting and got into needlepoint. And I've told her since I started doing this, and I'm a little nuts about it. Anything I get into, I go into up to my neck. But I have been telling her, you've got your needlepoint and your painting. I've got my podcasting. It's the same kind of thing. I'm doing something creative. I'm creating a program instead of a sampler. But it's the same kind of thing. I've got output from it. And actually in the last year, it started paying money, which made it even more like a job, instead of a hobby. So I am a terrible one to ask for advice on how to separate that out. I tend to seem to always kind of veer back to doing the things that I do as part of my work in my personal life and my private life. And it's kind of for me, it's got to be very intentional. I'm going to choose something to do that is not connected to my job in order to provide some separation there.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating answer. And if I could, as a therapist for a moment, respond to it, what I would say is, honestly, it sounds like you're a very contented, happy person who really enjoys what you do. And so the line between your work and things that are hobby work for you gets kind of blurry because you kind of walking a fine line between the two of them. And the real, if you will, unhappiness for you is the doubt that you have about yourself. And so I would say, just and not that you're asking for this advice, but I will say, I give you permission to enjoy the work that you do as a hobby now. And actually, it's even producing actual money. But that's not you're doing it for the love of it and you're doing it for the joy of it. It sounds to me like if it were to stop producing enjoyment, or if there was nothing interesting to do, very likely probably would peter out because the motivation would be gone. But the motivation for you is in the doing of it and the learning and the researching and the going deep. And so there's really nothing wrong with that. And for me personally, I will say it's very relatable. As a therapist, I have always been interested in continuing my education, whether it's learning about dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment based therapy, internal family systems, all these techniques that I use to help other people with their lives. I don't stop doing it because 5 o'clock, like the whistle blew. I love to do my continuing education, learn about things, watch documentaries, if you will, podcasts, whatever. I love to absorb that information. And I think it's really okay to have a blurry line if it's something that you do where you're enjoying it and it also happens to be your work, like kind of intellectually speaking, if you're following what I said.
Well, I definitely following what you're saying. And based on the response that I've gotten from people to the different podcasts, I really think if I were not as into it, I wouldn't be bringing listeners along with me that also getting them into it. Think there is kind of an infectiousness to my exuberance that I love this. I really love this. The selection of Pluribus as another ultimate podcast took a long time. I looked at a lot of things, and a lot of people were saying, "Oh, you got to do this to this, and you got to do this to Fallout, you got to do this to Silo, and you got to do this." All of these other shows that people were wanting me to do this ultimate breakdown on, I would watch them and go, that's a good show, but it didn't thrill me. It didn't excite me. Severance blew me away. I watched I remember watching the pilot and thinking, wow. And thankfully, it was all out at the time I found it. I found it this summer after it had released, the first season had fully released. And I watched the whole thing in a night. I watched 9 hours of Severance in a night and was so just transported by everything about it. And I didn't get that from Fallout. Fallout's good. I like Walton Scoggins. I like a lot of the characters. There was a lot for me about Fallout that was just too gooey. That I don't like that. I don't want a lot of grub blood and goo and, that kind of thing is not pleasant to me. I don't want to watch it and I don't want to relate it to people. I don't want to talk about it to people. So when I came across Pluribus was just so different as it's an alien invasion story with no aliens. It's a sci-fi story with very little sci-fi. It's just so well presented and so well acted. Ray Seahorn is amazing. And the story structure, you can tell the person creating this story is a master at it, and it's Vince Gilligan. And, he has told us some of the best stories we've ever heard as a society with Walter White and Breaking Bad and with Better Call Saul. So, you're in the hands of a master. And then to get this idea that he's been nurturing and working on for 10 years, you could just tell it just stood out head and shoulders above everything else that was out there as this property that I was blown away by. So, and I happened to be sick in November when it dropped, and I was getting all these emails from people You've got to watch this. You've got to do this. This is your next podcast. You got to do this. And I didn't get in on it until about the third or fourth episode and was so into it. I remember every week when I'd get that little notice on my phone that Apple TV said a new episode of Pluribus is available, I would get excited about that. I'm 61 years old. Not a lot gets me thrilled anymore. I'm not going, boy, but I would see that and go, cool. And I could not wait to get Apple TV open and start watching the newest episode of Pluribus. That told me right there, this is your next podcast. You got to start working on this. So even before the first season had completely dropped, I was already bookmarking articles and looking up interviews and finding YouTube clips, talking to Vince Gilligan and Racey Horn and everybody to prep to get ready for doing the show. And there is the same kind of, because I've already done it once for Severance, I kind of know how to put one together and I can do it a little more quickly, but it's still, there's a lot of needlepoint to it. It is like crocheting. When I build one of these shows, putting all the little sound clips in and all the drop-ins, I write a script for an hour show. It's about a 30-page script. I wrote 90 pages about episode 1 of Pluribus. So it's 3 hours. I did 3 hours on a 53-minute show. And part 2 just dropped this last week. And then when I record it, and then I start producing it. And producing, it takes about an hour to produce 10 minutes of finished podcast content. So when you listen to a 1-hour podcast, I have put at least 6 to 10 hours into editing that, just the editing part of it. That's not the writing, not the recording. Every episode, I kind of estimate there's about 40 hours tied up in creating 1 hour of podcast episode with the research, the writing, the producing, and the editing. So it is a ton of work, but I do think that people hear that time, that quality, that effort that was put into it. They can hear that in it, and it's worth it. And then I will output that, and I will go sit on the deck with a beer and listen to it, and just listen back to that. That, for me, it's like after you've painted a room, how that you look at it all the time, you just keep going back in and looking because it looks so cool. That's how it is for me creating a new podcast. I want to go back and listen to it. It's like, ooh, that little snip worked great there, and that little comment came off real well. So, that's the real value for me, is that going in there, creating it, and then kind of enjoying it as a listener.
Yeah. I would say that, one of my favorite Alanisms, if you will, is say what now? Like, you say that a few times. Anytime you say that, I don't know if you've said it on your Pluribus Ultimate podcast, but I know you say it several times in the Severed podcast, and I'm with you. Like, I think you are taking people along on a journey, and I think it is. Oh, I hate that word, journey. Sorry, I probably will cut that out. You are taking people along on a kind of like a vacation, a trip, and seeing all of the environment associated with each of these shows. And I think that you can't fake that. And I would say, myself having my little podcast where I'm talking about my love, which is mental health and wellness and everything like that, I feel the same way. And actually, sometimes I listen back to my podcast as well, and I enjoy it. There are things in my podcast that are supportive and enjoyable and fun to listen to and interesting to listen to. I'm like, wow, I did that. It's cool. And I'm proud of it. So I hear you 100%. I mean, I think your ultimate podcasts are that. They are like at the next level, and they are really wonderful and brilliant. And I've already learned some really interesting things that I didn't even imagine anything about Pluribus. It made Pluribus more interesting to me. Hearing your podcast, including all the information about Albuquerque. I listened to a little bit of your podcast that just dropped today, and the licking of the donuts piece. I barely even clocked that. Now I have to go back and watch it again. We don't want to spoil anything for anybody, but just go watch. We're still on episode 1 with Alan, so you have plenty of time.
That little piece there, a friend of mine told me, he said, what you're doing is just watching more slowly than the rest of us. And really, he's got a point. I am stopping it every 3 seconds, every 4 seconds. I'm listening to someone say a phrase, and then I'm pausing it and looking at the frame and looking at what went into that frame. And in that one scene, it's at a guard desk. and this is halfway through the first episode. It's not like a super spoiler or anything. We haven't even unleashed the virus on the world yet, but
we're starting.
We're getting close, but there's a scene where this doctor walks into a research facility, and at the guard desk, the guard has a couple of boxes of donuts. Well, she pauses and lifts the lid of the donut. I happen to freeze that, and I was looking at it, and I'm trying to see what it says on the box of donuts. And it says something like the best donuts in Arlington, or the favorite donuts of Maryland. And I'm thinking, what? And I started looking, then I went back and watched the scene specifically for those shots where I could see that donut box. And I caught the name Sandy Doney. So it was a Sandy Pony. So then I go online and I search Sandy Pony, and I find Sandy Pony Donuts in the Washington, D.C. area. And on their website, so then here's the connection, I'm following the trail of breadcrumbs from seeing the little bit on the screen, and then I get to Sandy Pony's website, and here they have an entire section going, guess what? We're on Pluribus. They've got a news release. They've got a little game you can play about licking the donuts. So there are little things out there. Nothing about that was hidden or put away somewhere, and I went out and found it. It was all out there, and it was very public. It's just I'm kind of bringing all these threads together into one package so that you get all of those things in there. And stuff like that for me is just fun. That's just that enhances my enjoyment of the show. And that's the kind of thing when I watch TV just personally, I do that. I'm a terrible one. Don't ever watch TV with me. I'm terrible because I'm always freezing it going, haven't we seen her in something before? Don't we know her from somewhere? And then I'm opening my iPad IMDb trying to find that character. I'm going to the current show we're watching, and I find them and I link and go, oh, she was in so and so and so and so. I'm terrible to watch TV for, but listen to the podcast. It's the kind of thing I do on the podcast. Where have I seen this person before? Well, we do a bio on them, so. But yeah, that Sandy Pony Donuts thing was one of those. It's like police where they find some connection or some piece of evidence that ties things together. That's how I feel after finding something like Sandy Pony Donuts. It's like, yeah, cool. And it's something that I hadn't heard anybody talk about in an interview. I hadn't heard anybody mention, we brought these donuts in special from the East Coast, and they had them shipped to Albuquerque. They had them shipped cross country.
Wow.
So just stuff like that I am lucky enough to find when I slow things down and watch the show very slowly. So a friend of mine is very right. I just watch things more slowly than most people and catch these details. And I have so many people coming back to me, especially after Severance, going, I rewatched Severance after listening to your podcast, and it was an entirely different experience for me because there were so many things that I was not even paying attention to or aware of that you kind of pointed out. And now I'm looking at when I watch it again. And that for me is very fulfilling. I feel like there is some value to what I'm doing, and some people are getting something out of it. It's not just me blathering for an hour about 20 minutes of a show.
Absolutely. Absolutely not blathering at all. And as a matter of fact, there is a tradition for what you're doing, except for how it comes about. Let me explain. Have you ever seen on any of your DVDs that you can listen to commentary from the director? Actually, Ben Stiller and Owen Wilson do it on Zoolander, I think. Have you ever heard that stuff?
I've been listening to director commentary since DVDs were first released.
Okay, of course.
Oh, yeah. Right? I love director
So that's what you're doing, in my opinion. What you're doing is not director commentary, but you are, because you don't have the knowledge of, wait a minute, I'm going to go really deep for a second with the Ortbo, where you sat and tried to figure out what the dates were when they were in that reserve where they're like going around in the snow. Again, spoilers. But like where they're outside in the snow, you were saying, well, Ben Stiller said this in Variety, and this one said this here. Do you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
So
because the time that they were up there shooting that was really a moving target, and I think they had some pre-production people in that were there for a few weeks, and they had Jeremy Hindle in for a while, the set deck guy doing, and he was there for a couple of weeks, but nobody was there at the same time. It kind of overlapped, so they were up there for a couple of months. months, but no individual person was up there for more than about 3 weeks, I think. That's kind of how it seemed to settle out. So even the director, he didn't know all those details. And I was able to go find from these other people talking about it, these other situations that kind of explain the whole story, and you get a bigger picture of it. Because even director commentary, the director doesn't always know everything about what went on with the production. There are other people involved that, had some story that was fun or interesting that, that impacted a scene that maybe the director didn't know that backstory. And I'm able, just by going out and finding all of these other interviews, and so many of the people involved with Severance tell such great stories. The sound guys, awesome interview with a real niche kind of website about, doing sound and things. But they had some fantastic stories, which I incorporated into the podcast. So finding all those little details is fun, and pulling them all together and creating the script out of it. And it's just a good time. And I'm just so glad that people are into it.
Yeah, well, I think you worked really hard, and it's actually kind of bringing us to a close. I'm going to skip our untangle this because I feel like we've untangled so many questions today with Alan. But I am telling you, I think that you are bringing many people along for the ride on these deep dives, these ultimate deep dives. And it definitely is your brand of thing to bring to the world, that we are getting these ultimate treatments of these amazing shows. And I am so grateful. I am betting many listeners are really grateful. And I want to thank you so much for being on my podcast. I'm hoping anyone who gets to hear it or see it, if we put it up on YouTube, enjoys it as well. I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts you want to share with the audience before we sign off.
Well, I just want to heavily promote Hello Carol, the Ultimate Pluribus podcast. Go find it. Any podcast player, you can go search it. You will find it. You're not missing out on anything. We're still working on the very first episode. You do have to have Apple TV. I went in for a doctor visit just recently, and my doctor's talking to me. So you're retired, right? And I said, yeah. What are you doing now? What are you doing to keep yourself busy?
Well,
20 minutes later, explaining all of it. And Doc did not have Apple TV, so he hasn't seen either Severance or Pluribus, but he was I got him interested in it. He said he was thinking about signing up for Apple TV, and he might check those out. So that is, go ahead, spend the $8 a month. They've got some great intro offers. If you go search them out with Apple TV, they'll give you 3 months free. That's plenty of time to check out Pluribus and Severance. You can go do that kind of thing. If it doesn't fit in the budget, you can still check out these shows. You might want to check out Ted Lasso while you're there. Apple TV's got some great stuff. They're just such a tiny, tiny streamer compared to like Netflix or Hulu and the big guys. They just do not have the signups that these bigger ones had because they came later.
Yes.
Yeah, get on there, check it out. You can still get in on Pluribus right at the beginning of it. I am trying to kick out a podcast a week for the rewatch. I am also working on a rewatch, an Origins series on the Severance side, where I'm doing a breakdown of the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Two podcast episodes into that, which represents about 40 minutes of the movie, which is 2 hours and 18 minutes, I think. So there's a lot more to go there with Eternal Sunshine, which is a big Dan Erickson influence. Also, Ben Stiller, a big fan of that movie. So I'm working on those. At the same time, I'm working on the Pluribus rewatch. I may have to take a week off from one or the other of them coming up here, but I'm going to try and keep kicking out new content through the spring is my intention.
Well, you are more than entitled, as far as I'm concerned, to take a vacation, because there's actually quite the catalog. So I think there's a lot to listen to. So you're, in my opinion, as you're not your manager, say go on your vacation, because I'm sure you'll be refreshed and ready to bring us more terrific behind the scenes and interesting information. So I say we sign off here. Thank you so much, Alan, for the time and for doing this again from our first Severed podcast to now. I really appreciate it. And I hope the listeners will take a listen to both of your podcasts, and actually even check out, I don't know where the WKRP in Cincinnati podcast is, but if that's still hosted, check that out.
and available. That was my first foray into podcasting with my wife. It is a very different attitude than either Severance or Pluribus. It's a sitcom. We laugh a lot of jokes. WKRP was the reason I got into radio. It was on from 1978 to 82. I started in radio 3 months before my 16th birthday in 1980, and all I knew about radio was what I had seen on WKRP. So it was very influential in my young career, and it was a blast to go back and rewatch those shows that some of them I hadn't seen in 25 years. So yeah, if you're into sitcoms, old sitcoms, yeah, I mean, it's the old TV, got to have a new episode every single week. So some of them aren't great. Some of them are really amazing, but some of them are kind of weak, and we don't pull any punches. We tell you which are which. But it was a fun podcast, an entirely different attitude. My wife was not nearly as enamored with the entire podcast process as I was. When we were, she signed on for KRP and she stayed through all 90 episodes. She did 2.5 years of it. But then when I said, hey, what are we going to do next? She said, I don't think I want to do any more podcasting.
I'm going to do needlepoint. That's what I'm going to do now.
Needlepoint and painting. That's what she's working on. And that's fine. That's the thing that interests her. So yeah, so go check out WKRP. It's my first attempt. The first season is, I think, really rough. I can barely listen to it.
Okay. But we know we definitely, I'm sure. And we know that the thing that we really want to get the listeners to go check out is the new Hello Carol, the Ultimate Pluribus podcast, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And thank you again to Alan Stair for being on my podcast, Real Over Ideal. And don't forget, keep it real over ideal.